not enough to simply win elections. We have to ask ourselves, how do we actually live equitably together? And that's the big challenge of now.
This moment of crisis creates opportunity where we could begin to develop an alternate model.
In terms of the future of democracy, we are at a really crucial inflection point. The question is, can we do the work and the organizing for a kind of renewal?
If we come together and we work slow and steady, we can diffuse white supremacy, we can overcome.
Still coming up on the Laura Flanders Show, the place for the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the people who are doing it. Hi, I'm Laura Flanders, and as I record this on November 4th, much remains undecided about election 2020, but not this. More Americans participated in these elections than have voted in any presidential race in decades. More Americans were engaged, but we remain a divided country, and there's still an epidemic, a recession, and possibly bitter legal battles ahead. So where are we? How did we get here? And what happens next? For a first swipe at trying to answer what sound like a set of very existential questions, I'm joined by Maurice Mitchell, the National Director of the Working Families Party, Scot Nakagawa, Senior Partner of ChangeLab, and Stacy Mitchell. In relation to Maurice, she is co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. We'll also hear from Amy Allison of She the People. Let's start with you, Maurice. What were the takeaway surprises as far as you're concerned?
One of the stories that I think we're going to hear from this, when all the votes are counted and we're looking at the returns from places like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, is like the returns from our cities, like Milwaukee and Philadelphia and Detroit, would be determinative. And those returns are, you're talking about mainly Black communities, Black and brown communities, working class communities that turned out, and there was record turnout. You know, I think Colorado had the highest turnout of any state ever in history, and the turnout that we had collectively it meets a historic high mark. I don't think there's been decades since we turned out like this as a country. So there's a lot to dig into.
Stacy, what about you? Any surprises from the evening? We're just talking hours, really, after polls closed.
Yes, I mean, I agree with Maurice about the turnout is really quite striking. Some of the things I thought were really striking were some of the ballot referendums. So in Nebraska, it looks like people are voting against payday lenders, to put regulations on payday lenders. In Arizona, a tax on the wealthy to pay for education. And there are quite a number of $15 an hour minimum wage passed overwhelmingly in Florida. And so what's interesting about this election is that there seems to be some fairly clear support for policies that would help working people really across the board, including in some fairly red places, and yet not an alignment between that impulse and the political parties. We've had a truly awful year in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the economy, just in terms of the racism in our country. And yet, despite all of that, we have a very divided electorate that we did not decisively in large margins throw out the president.
I think that speaks to something that we should be keeping our eyes on. Trump spent the last 4 years destroying norms left and right, and has somehow nonetheless retained his base and made this a closer election than any of us anticipated, at least based on the polling. You know, I don't follow elections at the really granular level that many people do, because really what I'm concerned about are trends, right? I'm an anti-authoritarian, so I look for what are the trends? Which way are we going? Are we going toward autocratization, or are we going toward democracy? And I still see us going toward autocratization, and I think some of that is evident by the closeness of the results. and the fact that Trump did better than he did the last time with just about every demographic group but white men, right? Including that group that I belong to, other, which speaks to, how little we actually know about why people are making those choices. But I think all of those things are indications that we are in big, big trouble.
Here's a clip of Donald Trump in the early hours of November 4th.
Millions and millions of people voted for us tonight, and a very sad group of people is trying to disenfranchise that group of people, and we won't stand for it. We will not stand for it. This is a major fraud in our nation. We want the law to be used in a proper manner. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list, okay? It's a very sad moment. To me, this is a very sad moment, and we will win this, and as far as I'm concerned, we already have won it.
Coming back to you on this question, Scott, you're not alone in having huge questions about Trump's enduring appeal. As you hear him there, reprising old language around fraud, fraudulent election, a fraud, a sad attempt to steal something, what do you hear? And what do you think we're still not getting as a nation about his messaging?
Social media has basically debased journalism in the United States. And, when you're on social media, the things that come by you, the things that you see are usually driven by rage. Because that's the stuff that goes viral. And so that's the stuff that breaks through the silo and actually gets into your screen so that you see these things and you start to understand the world in the most polarizing possible way. And so, we need some regulation in those areas. I think that, what we're really witnessing is a kind of inability on our part to see ourselves as one country, as one unified nation, one people, with shared interests in building a strong welfare state that can equitably serve our needs, especially at times like now when there's a pandemic, right? We have seen that eroding since the late 60s. It increased greatly in the Reagan years in the 80s. And really since the election of Trump, that slide toward more autocratic government went from like this to just really right down the slide. And at this point, I think that we're in real danger.
Maurice, do you want to come in on this? I mean, it does seem to me that the degree of shock that's out there, that it wasn't just a huge blue wave, shock on the sort of progressive Democratic side needs to be closely looked at.
The Democrats for decades had chosen to align with Wall Street at times when working people were looking for real relief, and created a wedge between them and everyday working people. And that creates the space for far-right authoritarians and authoritarian sort of far-right populists to be able to help make meaning for people who are feeling socially and economically dislocated. And it creates for white workers an opportunity to be able to seduce white workers into and organize them into the ideology of white nationalism. And so there's work to be done. It's one of the reasons why the far right attacks labor unions, one of the spaces where white workers, Black workers, Latinx workers, Asian workers, and Native workers have to struggle together and make decisions together, and protects a lot of folks from sort of white nationalism and other forces. So again, yes, it's great that Trump got the boot, and we're gonna have to do a lot of work over years in order to transform the conditions on the ground.
So autocracy, white supremacy, patriarchy, monopoly is woven in there, Stacy. It seemed to me that in the year up to this point, we were seeing some movement on antitrust activism in the Congress. My question to you is, what happens to that next? And again, how come in an economy that saw that divide between most and a few get bigger than ever, the appeal of this Trump vision of deregulation and don't let the socialists get your health care still held as much appeal as it seems to have?
Well, I think I think we are at a really crucial and perilous, inflection point. And, the opportunity is both to slide into something really disturbing in terms of the future of democracy. And then there is also the opportunity for a kind of renewal of what government means and the notion of government authority over the public authority over the economy, over corporations. I think one thing that is hopeful is that neoliberalism, I think, as an ideology that anyone believes in, is essentially dead. I mean, this year killed it. There is, this idea that we should shrink government and that markets can deliver everything. I think that's done. I think we have a much wider understanding, especially because of what we've seen in the wake of the pandemic, that governments create winners and losers. They create the structures that allow for markets, that allow for the types of economic structures we have, and that the policy choices that we make through government, determine how widely shared is prosperity, how broadly distributed is ownership, power, wealth, or how concentrated is it. So I think there is this there is this moment now of understanding that government policy really matters. I think the question and the death of this ideology that has dominated now for 40 years or more, the question is there something that is ready to replace it? And can we do the work and the organizing to have that vision and that worldview take over going forward? I think to your question about monopoly, to me, one of the most exciting things that has happened in the past year has been the work in the antitrust subcommittee of the House, where we saw sort of a bipartisan 15-month investigation led by Democrats, but with some Republican support, that concluded that the most powerful corporations, Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, need to be broken up and need to be regulated, and produce a very forceful report on that just in October. And I think that the work of that committee and what it showed about the role of government in structuring the economy is incredibly powerful. And the question now, I think, if there is an incoming Biden administration, is, are you going to act on those policy recommendations? Because my feeling about the Democratic Party is that they focus too much on campaigns and not enough on winning votes by actually delivering the policies that people want.
All right, so Scott, what do you think? Neoliberalism, dead, done, new attitude to government?
I think neoliberal ideology is dead. I think we still live in the wreckage of neoliberal policies, and not just here in the United States, but around the world, where we have exported free market kind of ways of understanding how to structure society in places where there is very little civil society in place to check those worst impulses. And we're experiencing the effects of that now. My job is to follow and respond to illiberal right-wing movements, right? And so, one of the things I've learned in trying to come to understand who they are and what makes them tick is really kind of taking a, different view, taking their side and looking at the world through their eyes. And when you do that, you realize they're really reacting to all the same things we are, but differently. And one of the things they're reacting to is that neoliberal wreckage, the unresponsiveness of government, extreme wealth polarization. All of these things are things that people from the right are, in fact, reacting to, just as we are. In places where, for example, I used to live in Portland, Oregon. If you live in Portland, Oregon, every single office in the city of Portland, in the county it's in, is blue, right? If you're a Republican voter, your legislative district may never have a candidate for you to vote on. That's about the corrupting power of money in politics, just as much as it is when it's on our side. And so, we're in a situation where, as long as we're in the majority, we feel quite satisfied with that, but we have to recognize that that's not real democratic participation. That's the kind of thing that causes people to radicalize. And so while we may disagree with their ideas, we do need to come up with some real solutions here. And I think we need to demand them of the Biden administration to look at progressive economic measures that address, for example, the complete economic devastation of rural Oregon. There is just no program on the horizon that's going to address the problems there. And as a result, we see there right-wing movement rising, timber unity, that is dividing the state right in half, right? They talk about the fear of the tyranny of the majority. It's kind of under Brexit, we said that people were concerned about austerity, and then we realized, no, they were just afraid of austerity, right? Well, these folks are afraid of the tyranny of the majority being imposed on them. But we do have a system that allows that to happen. As a gay person who was in Oregon through the years when 35 anti-gay ballot measures were put on ballots, I feel that very personally. We were basically put in a position where popularity contests were run over whether or not we would have basic citizenship rights. And our neighbors got to decide that for us. And so, these are all very real things that they're reacting to. And it speaks to, the need to think deeply about how we reform our democracy. It's not enough to simply win elections. We have to ask ourselves, how do we actually live equitably together? And that's the big challenge of now. Trump is basically saying we are too intolerant of people to move forward together, and more people are answering yes. We have to figure out what the alternative to that is.
I mean, we've seen it before in this country that the prospect of an inclusive society is so frightening to so many, they would rather destroy their society, whether it's their local public school, their local public hospital, their small southern, no longer segregated town, and some places in the north too. I mean, Maurice, how do you get the sort of change that will affect people where they live, given whatever the next administration looks like?
Well, I think there's multiple ways to get at that, and I can agree more that the neoliberalism is illegible in this moment. However, we haven't developed a alternate model, right? And I think that creates an opportunity, like this moment of crisis creates an opportunity where we could begin to develop an alternate model. And one of the things that we at Working Families Party launched very recently is a sort of roadmap from crisis to care called the People's Charter that begins to lay out a framework to think about a world that we could potentially live in that puts at the center working people. And we need to begin to actually build a new model of how we think about one another, how we think about what an economy should do, what government should do, and we need to popularize that, right? We need to create new popular models of how we need to sort of be with one another.
You have a model a bit like that, Stacy. Didn't the Institute release something like that early this fall?
Yes, over the summer we released a guide to state and local policy to check corporate power and sort of rebuild local economic institutions, or I should say build, not rebuild, but build local economic institutions. And I think that's so right, like this idea that we need to think about, well, what is an economy for? What do we want? And the notion that people who work in this economy are the experts. They are the ones who understand how things work. I mean, one of the real problems, I think, of what we've experienced in the last 40 years is the tyranny of the expert class, of the economists who have driven trade policy, who've driven monopoly policy, who've driven all of these subsidies and tax advantages for big corporations and the wealthy people under a set of economic theories that has nothing to do with the real world. And people who live in the real world have a much better understanding of how these forces work. In a lot of communities at the local level, people are grappling with problems from a practical standpoint. They need to get to a solution. And our theory is that we work a lot at the local level, and our theory is that by engaging with people at that level, we begin to build a constituency that then recognizes the importance of this stuff that needs to happen at the federal level, because we do need the muscle of the federal government ultimately to right some of these big structural problems in the economy. One of the things I would really like to see happen is for a new administration, if we have one, and Congress, to go aggressively after corporate fraud, abuse, and anti-competitive behavior. And that means using the tools of agencies like the Federal Trade Commission that have long been dormant, but could play really an incredible role in all kinds of communities. I mean, farmers in rural areas are desperate for relief from the abusive practices of big ag. We have common stories across both cities and rural areas. For example, the growing loss of independent pharmacies and the lack, we're now seeing more and more communities becoming pharmacy deserts where you're missing this basic service.
And then they wonder how any vaccination is going to get out there. I mean, but it still goes back to, thank you, Stacy, it still goes back, Maurice, to how do we make this change happen? I mean, a lot of people were looking for a whole lot more change in the Senate than we're going to see.
Sure. I mean, well, the good news is that, there's always other elections. And so, I'm looking towards Wisconsin and Pennsylvania in 2022. And the type of change that we're talking about, I mean, if you look at, so folks spent billions of dollars literally on this election, right? And when you look at the allocations of where that money went, I still think far too much of that money goes to TV placements and goes to work that doesn't actually do the organizing that's necessary. Early investment in organizing is key because organizing actually allows people to have connection, meaning, belonging. In those spaces of connection, meaning, and belonging, folks begin to make meaning of the world. They begin to transform their consciousness. They begin to draw different types of connections. They begin to have aha moments about the world that they live in, about their relationship to other people. The type of organizing that we have to do in rural communities and suburban communities and urban communities over time is how we achieve the America that we want to live in. And this election has shown us that there's still a significant amount of people that, when given an opportunity to vote for Trump's version of America, they're choosing that. And we need to take that very seriously and be sober about that.
Well, there was certainly a really broad response to the Trump administration's deployment of federal agents to Portland to suppress protests, which was a right-wing move that then was joined by various different factions, from the Blue Boys to Proud Boys, other white nationalist factions. The response to that mobilization, I think, really helped us to kind of frame the moment for people, about what was really at stake, right? That what we needed to do was push back against these kinds of incursions against democratic participation in order to fight again another day.
The organizing in Portland is one example. On the Arizona story, here's Amy Allison, who I had a chance to talk with earlier, and you can see our full interview on social media.
I learned a lesson from the fantastic organizers in Arizona. People are like, how did Arizona flip? Did people change their mind? No. Arizona is a place, particularly in Maricopa County, but the whole state was run by Republicans with a white supremacist agenda. And being anti-immigrant, being the subject of dehumanization in the school system and all those places, it made this group of organizers both prepared, ready, creative, and they had a path to being able to bring more people in. It took more than 10 years of dedicated work year-round, registering people, gathering people, and saying that we can do it. And so I look at the women of color, a lot of Latinas in a place like Maricopa County, who have demonstrated that if we come together and we work slow and steady, that we can overcome, we can diffuse white supremacy, we can overcome.
So to you, Maurice, I think we're running out of time, but I worry that I'm being a little Pollyanna-ish, that there is, a great possible organizing future in front of us. We still have millions of people that seem to have voted for a guy who showed no visible sign of respect for a pandemic and even the health of his voters in the interests of resisting a multiracial, equitable future America. Help me here. Where do you go from here? And what are the lessons that you're drawing from this election for organizing going forward?
Everybody here, I think, essentially is aligned with this North Star of creating a more democratic economy and a more democratic society, right? And these electoral moments provide opportunities for us as a country to be able to take a temperature for where we are, be able to aggregate enough power in order to maybe have a stopgap against some of this concentration of corporate power or the alignment of white supremacist forces. But that North Star work has to happen in a much deeper way. It can't be tactical. And so we need to figure out how to align our tactics in ways where we're actually building real power and we're changing structures and we're changing culture. And I think if we do that, and if we acculturate enough people to that, then we could have a healthy relationship to electoral moments. We won't put all of our hopes and dreams in a charismatic electoral leader. We won't put all of our hopes and dreams in one election, one wave election. We'll understand that these are necessary tactical moves for people who have a long march agenda. When we bring people in to a broad-based economy, then we are draining the swamp for white supremacy. We are draining the swamp for social and economic dislocation. We are draining the swamp for cynicism, and we're creating the opportunity for people to see each other and see each other's fates see each other's fates when they look at the other. But until we do that work, we're always going to kind of be cobbled together like more than 300 million people in this big continent in these regions that almost don't have any sign of association to one another, struggling to stay together as a nation. So we're going to have to make some calls, but be committed to a long arc.
Well, Maurice, Scott, Stacy, it sounds like we're going to have to gather you all again some other time to continue this conversation. Thank you all for your work and for weighing in so well and so early in this process. I appreciate having you all. Thank you.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
For more on this episode and other forward-thinking content, and to tune into our podcast, visit our website at lauraflanders.org and follow us on social media at The LF Show.